Hello, everybody. My name is Laurie. My pronouns are he and him. I am delighted to be invited to speak here today. And I work at Netlify at the moment, where I am a data evangelist. Evangelist means I talk at conferences, apparently. Before I worked at Netlify, I co-founded NPM Inc., which you may have heard of. And before that, a company called Awesome, which I am positive that you did not. But what I am is a web developer. I started web development in 1996, and I have been in love with the web ever since then. My goal today is to give you a sense of where modern web development is today. Because too often developers work in a vacuum. We don't know if the tools that we're using are the cutting edge or they're old and obsolete. And knowing where you stand can help you make better technical choices. They can give you new things to learn or old tools to give up, or maybe just a warm, fuzzy feeling because you're doing the best thing right now. But how the hell do I know all of this stuff? The answer is that I asked people. In a pair of surveys in 2020 and 2021, we got over 10,000 responses, which is really gold medal quality for survey data. We use much smaller surveys to predict national elections. So to use this to talk about web development is really quite accurate. But obviously, no survey is perfect. Netlify ran the survey, and Netlify is a particular kind of web host. We specialize in a kind of development called the Jamstack, which focuses on performant pre-rendered content on the front end using APIs to dynamically fetch data. Jamstack is a very popular model for deploying websites these days, but it's obviously not the only one. So the data is biased towards the Jamstack and also to front-end development in general. I've tried to make that clear and I've tried to correct for it, but you should absolutely consider that this data with that in mind. So let's start with talking about who we are, and the most obvious thing to ask there is, what is your job? As you can see in our survey data, 82% of respondents were engineers. You can also see how they split up. 45% say they were front-end, 32% full stack, 5% back-end. Clearly, this is not all web developers. In real life, not 5% of people are only 5% of people are back-end developers. So the bias in this sample towards front-end development is clear, but that doesn't mean it's bad data. If you're a front-end or a full-stack engineer, this is going to be super helpful to you. And if you're a back-end engineer, then you should be taking this data with a grain of salt. Our first fun discovery happened when we tried splitting up developers by their level of experience and the region that they live in at the same time. We weren't really expecting to find a pattern here at all, but instead we found this. In the most experienced group, people with 15 years of experience or more, developers were concentrated in North America and the EU. Only 15% of developers in that category, in that experience level, came from outside of those two regions. But in the least experienced group, that percentage rose to 48%, nearly half. I love this finding because it seems like we're watching the evolution of a developer community. More developers are breaking into the industry from more places. And we're hoping that this greater geographical diversity will improve other kinds of diversity in the web development community as well. I was pleased to see that when GitHub released their Octoverse survey 2 weeks ago, they found exactly the same growth in exactly the same regions. This being 2021, we also asked developers about the pandemic and how it's affected their lives. Excuse me, I managed to catch my first cold of the pandemic, so. Obviously, the pandemic has affected everyone and everything, but we were interested about what changes happened in web development specifically. We asked a very specific question, which was, did your job go remote as a result of the pandemic, and will it stay remote even after the pandemic? And that's a very specific question, but even so, 31% of people said yes. And again, when GitHub asked the same question in their survey, they got very similar results 2 weeks ago. In fact, the effect is even stronger when you split people up by experience again. People who are in the first 2 years of their careers were less likely to have gone remote. They were more likely to say that they lost a job as a result of the pandemic. But past the first 2 years, the percentage saying that they went remote rose to 40%. This is a huge, huge change in the way that developers live and work, and it's going to be years before the true effects of that change have become clear. So what story should we take from this demographic data? Well, you should take it to help you understand who this data is really about. Clearly, it's about a big chunk of web developers, but it's not going to be true of everybody. It's still some of the best data that we have in the industry about the working lives of web developers, but I want to be upfront about its imperfections. So now we know who we're talking about. What are all those folks doing? Excuse me. There's lots of ways to answer that question. But the most obvious thing to ask is, what is the site that you are building for? Lots of people work on more than one thing in a year, so we allowed people to give multiple answers. So these will add up to well over 100. The top answer is personal sites, because you always work on your own site. But business to business, B2B, and business to consumer, business to B2C, are 35% and 33% respectively. It is not news to economists that, but I think it's news to a lot of people that there's as much money to be made selling from one business to another as there is selling from your business to ordinary people. It's also not news to anyone that e-commerce at 34% is one of the driving economic forces of the web. Not all B2B or B2C considers itself e-commerce. But I think an aspect of that is surprising is that lead capture all by itself is way up there at 29%. It begins to explain to me why whenever I visit a website these days, it pops up an annoying modal dialog that demands that I give it my email address. Similarly huge at 29% is internal tools. And the story that I want you to think about here is, how much attention do you pay to these categories? How much of your team's time is invested in selling to businesses, to lead capture, to internal tools? Are you focusing too much on some things? Are you giving some things too much time and attention and not enough to other categories? What is the relative quality of your output in those categories? The next question we asked was about how dynamic your site is. We had options from a totally static site to a fully dynamic site, and also single page apps. In this question, we made sure to ask about all sites, not just Jamstack sites. And we had a separate question for Jamstack sites that I'm not going to talk about here. The answer is that they're very similar, which seems like it might be a boring answer, but I think that is a fascinating result. We spend almost as much time creating totally static sites as we do single page apps. Does it feel like we spend equal amounts of time on the tooling for those types of apps? The huge boom in the popularity of static site generators that I'll talk about in the framework section seems like it's being driven by this data. Another way to ask what we're building is what devices we're building it for. For the last few years, the mantra of thought leaders in web development has been mobile first. You should build your website to work on a phone first and add desktop features later. In the US, 88% of consumer internet time is spent accessing the web from mobile devices, so it seems like good advice. Are we following that good advice? No, we are not. Desktop is the most important to us, with 98% of people saying that it is somewhat or very important as a target. Phones are second at 94%, which is really close. And tablets are 91%, but this gap is bigger than it sounds, because when you ask people if the target is very important, 84% of people say desktop is very important, but only 71% say phones, and less than half say tablets. So are we ignoring good advice, or is mobile first bad advice? Similarly to the importance of mobile, we asked developers about their priorities in other areas, and we got them to rank them. We asked this question both in 2020 and in 2021 and got similar answers both times, although security ranked a little bit higher in 2021. But the number one answer both years was performance, and after that, uptime. So what we're implicitly saying here is that we want our websites to be fast, and it's okay if they're down sometimes, as long as they're fast. That's an interesting implication, isn't it? Does it match your experience of the web? In the same data, security comes third and compliance comes fifth. So the implication there is that it's okay for your website to leak data as long as it stays up and it works fast. And it's okay if it violates privacy laws as long as it stays up and it works fast and it's secure. Is that right? Are those the correct priorities? I don't know if they're correct, but they're certainly the accurate priorities. The web is full of fast websites that break and violate user privacy and leak data all the time. Our final question about what we're doing is about how big the audience is that we're doing it for. Here again, people could work on lots of sites, so they could give multiple answers. The most common size of audience is thousands of users. This is, by web standards of scale, pretty small. And one of the advantages of Jamstack is that because it's on a CDN, it scales really well to millions of users. But websites at the scale of thousands of users, they don't need that. What they need is performance and uptime, which is another thing that they get from the CDN. In fact, it's very instructive to compare our audience size data with our priorities data. If performance is your goal, and we say that it is, then at scale, caching works really well. But at small user sizes, caching isn't going to work. You're going to get a lot of cache misses and a lot of slow hits. So you're probably going to need to pre-render things. Obviously, pre-rendering is a feature of the Jamstack. So basically, this data is sort of explaining one of the underlying drivers of the popularity of Jamstack as an architectural model. So now we come to our third section, the real core of our data, which is technology choices. Not who's doing it or what we're doing, but how. We have some special ways of measuring this that it's worth taking a second to explain. I'm going to show you a bunch of graphs that look like this. The size of the bubbles is how aware people are of a technology. How far to the right is how many people are actually using it, and how high up it is a ratio that we call the satisfaction score. If more people want to use your technology more, then your satisfaction score is over 1.0. If your satisfaction score is less than 1.0, that means that more people say that they want to use your technology less than they do right now. I'll also show you a few graphs like this, which show how these numbers changed from 2020 to 2021. If you go to the right, that means you gained users. If you go left, you lost users. If you go up, your users got happier. If you go down, your users got less happy. You'll see that a very common pattern as a technology gains users is it loses satisfaction, since early users tend to be a better fit than later adopters. The first technology choice we looked at was the start of the process, which is design. This is a great example of how these graphs work. You can see that everyone has heard of Adobe XD. The bubble is huge, but usage is only 36%. Satisfaction is 1.4, so its users are happy, but Figma blows it and everything else away. Figma's usage is 62%, and its satisfaction score is 8.8. Nearly everybody else on this graph is below 1.0, so they have unhappy users. A big category of our questions was about CMS, or content management systems. The reason that we spent a lot of time on it is because of the answer to another question, which was, what third-party APIs do you use to put your site together? The most popular one was authentication, but there's no mystery in that question. People use Google, Facebook, Twitter, and GitHub to log in. The next, however, was content management systems, and there the field is much more crowded. Because there are so many CMS, we had to split them up into groups. The first group is traditional CMS. The unsurprising leader here is WordPress at 39% usage, with Drupal at 13% usage. But they both have low satisfaction scores, well under 1.0. There's a newer group called the headless CMS. These don't try to provide any design input. They just allow you to supply and edit content, and they provide an API for you to incorporate it into your site. WordPress has an API as well, and if you use it in headless mode, it's also very popular, and importantly, its satisfaction rises to over 1.0. But in this category, Contentful is the leader, and its users are twice as happy as WordPress. A newer category is what I'm calling the design-led CMS. These tools make the visuals of the content a priority, and they provide sophisticated visual editors, often with libraries of templates to help you get started. A surprise to me was that the leader here is Wix, although its satisfaction is well below 1.0. Webflow is both popular and has happy users, as does Builder. Putting all of those together, you can get a broader picture of the CMS space. WordPress is strongest by usage, Sanity is strongest by satisfaction, and Contentful is the most popular option that still has happy users. But now let's look at year-on-year changes in this data. We weren't tracking everyone last year, so we don't have everyone's year-on-year changes, but you can still see some big changes. Strappy and Sanity both gained a lot of usage and lost steeply in satisfaction. This is that pattern that I mentioned we would see. Keep in mind that they both have very high absolute satisfaction. Their users are very happy. They're just less happy than they were last year. The other obvious change of note is WordPress, which is losing usage. And although its users are unhappy, unsurprisingly, the ones who've stuck with it are the ones who are happiest. What to take away from all of this? Well, there's no clear leaders in the CMS space, but I would say that headless CMS as a category is currently the strongest one, and Contentful is the leader there, with Strappy and Sanity both strong options to look at. If you want a strong visual editor, Webflow seems to be the right choice. Our next set of data is about programming languages, and I am not going to be recommending a programming language to anyone because everyone's tastes are very different and very strong. But it is interesting to see the breakdown because the results are something of a surprise. JavaScript amongst web developers is nearly universal at 96%, but at 67%, the next most used language is good old SQL. TypeScript comes in very strong at 60%, and then Bash, shell scripting, comes in at 52%. I think the biggest surprise here is TypeScript. TypeScript claims to be just JavaScript, but TypeScript developers don't seem to think that. They call themselves TypeScript developers. They don't call themselves JavaScript developers. TypeScript is at 60% usage overall, but 15% of users identify TypeScript as their primary programming language over JavaScript, while 55% of people say that JavaScript is their primary programming language. What about the year-on-year changes in the language data? There's a ton to talk about here. Obviously, TypeScript is gaining a ton of share, and its users are happier than they were before, which is unusual. In the bottom right, Rust and Swift are gaining users but falling in satisfaction, which is much more like the usual pattern. In the top left, you can see that PHP is mostly static, and Ruby and Bash are both losing share. And then there's the bottom left. JavaScript is losing share and losing satisfaction. What is going on there? What I think this shows is a larger problem for the JavaScript language, which is that it is overextended. If you want to make a website in 2021, you have to use JavaScript or TypeScript. That's not good. It means that people who don't like JavaScript, people who aren't, they're going to have to use it, even though they hate it. People who aren't happy in a language are not going to write it well. We have to free the web from JavaScript. One possible route for doing that is WebAssembly or WASM. WASM provides a mechanism for any programming language to be compiled down to a simple form that can be executed at near native speeds inside the browser. People have done this with Rust and Go, and they've even done it with Python and PHP by including the interpreter along with the compilation. This is a very exciting development. But what does all this mean for you? Well, JavaScript for the moment still seems to be pretty inescapable, but learning TypeScript looks like a good choice, or at least good for your career. I think of TypeScript as a big project choice. It is essentially automated testing, and tests are great as your team scales up. On smaller projects, I prefer JavaScript, but then I prefer JavaScript anyway, so what do I know? Now for a very quick section, we didn't ask about a lot of backend technologies, but we were interested in what people were using. Some answers were obvious and unsurprising. Containers like Docker and orchestration like Kubernetes are very popular. And lots of people use microservices. But there was a surprise in this data, and it was serverless functions. Netlify has built-in support for serverless functions, so obviously we are big fans, but we were not prepared for the finding that 46% of people say that they are using serverless functions. That is nearly half of developers. That makes it an extremely mainstream choice. That explains why a lot of the frameworks that we're about to look at in the next section have made serverless functions a first-class feature of their framework. Which brings us to our final and biggest question, which is about web frameworks. There are thousands of them. People constantly argue about them. What's good and what's bad and how to use them properly. But let's step back for a second first and ask, why use a framework at all? Believe it or not, there was a time before web frameworks were invented, and I was a web developer then as well, and I'm here to tell you that it sucked. Every company had their own special snowflake of a web application, and they all did roughly the same thing, and they all did it slightly differently. So hiring somebody to work on your application was a process that could take weeks or months as they slowly learned the architecture and the idioms that your company had invented for itself. Ruby on Rails changed the way the web development industry works. Suddenly, your onboarding time was 0. People knew how to build a Rails app, and you could just hire somebody who knew how to build a Rails app. And it did that even though Ruby had some real performance problems at the time. The advantage of a framework is not really a technical one, it's a human one. Having other people know how your application works is a massive benefit. It almost doesn't matter what framework you pick because they'll all help you go faster. More people will help you find bugs, more people will answer questions, more people will ship plugins for it, more people will write documentation for it. But above all, you can hire people who already know how to work on your app. Frameworks may claim to help you scale your app, and some of them may even actually do that. But what they all do, what they definitely do, is help you scale your team. So in our data, we asked about 32 different frameworks, which is a lot. So like CMSs, we had to split them up into a couple of groups. The first is a very small crew known as component libraries. These do the very basics, and you do the rest, or use an additional framework on top of them. The biggest is React, and React is huge. 67% of people are using it, 2/3. We're going to talk more about React later. But Vue is also a very popular choice, and Svelte is doing quite well as well, and they all have very high satisfaction scores. People love using component libraries. Then there's static site generators, or SSGs. These are the unframeworks. They produce flat HTML to the user and little or no JavaScript on the client side, but they save you a lot of work on the server side. The current winner in this category is Gatsby, but we'll see a little later why that choice might not be so simple. Another possibility is Eleventy, which is smaller, but has huge satisfaction. The next group is kitchen sink frameworks, because they do everything and the kitchen sink. The major outliers in this data are already clear. Next.js, which is closely tied to React, has 43% usage and sky-high satisfaction. Nuxt, which is closely associated with Vue, is roughly as popular relative to Next as Vue is to React, so it's about half at 25%. SvelteKit is tied to Svelte, obviously, and it corresponds roughly to the popularity of that library at 8%. Vite is a newcomer and a bit of an exception because it's not tied to any particular component library. It can work with React or Vue or Svelte and a number of other component models. It can also be configured to work like an SSG, which is true of several of these kitchen sinks. Vite has amazing satisfaction and usage is already at 14%. SvelteKit is built on Vite. Then that data begins to get too crowded, so let's zoom into these frameworks that have less than 10% share. This is a mix of very old and very new frameworks. Ember, Meteor, and Happy are older. Redwood.js, Remix, and Blitz are all very new. Remix is so new that the public can't even use it yet, and yet somehow it has 3% reported usage. So I guess the people in the beta really like it. Now let's look at the other type of data, which is the year-on-year changes. First off, in the top right, React has grown while maintaining its level of satisfaction. That is a huge accomplishment when you're already so big. But Next.js added more than 20% share since last year and has also managed to improve its satisfaction score, which is incredibly impressive. Over in the bottom right, we'll see the pattern that we've come to expect. Eleventy, Nest, Preact, and VuePress, they form this neat straight line down and to the right. The bigger they got, the more satisfaction that they shed. The same happened, though less so, to bigger frameworks like Vue and Svelte and Nuxt. There were a bunch that didn't change much, and then there was Gatsby, which unfortunately shed users and satisfaction, which I think makes your choice of SSG in 2021 a little bit harder. One thing that I'm not tracking in this data that I promise to do a better job of in future is tracking usage of web components. Browsers have native support for web components, and there are some famous large-scale implementations of them, but it's quite a distributed ecosystem and hard to track, so it's been kind of a blind spot for me. Their usage is somewhere well under 10% right now, but they may finally be getting some traction, so I'm keeping my eye on them. So it's time to think about what all of this means for us. Is there a clear winner in frameworks? I don't think so. But there are some obvious, strong choices. A component library of some kind is a good idea. Everybody likes using them. And the strongest of those is React. If you're looking for a kitchen sink, Next.js is the clear leader, Nuxt is a strong competitor, and Vite and SvelteKit are very interesting options. But because of the performance data that we were looking at earlier, you might not want a kitchen sink framework. An SSG might be a better choice for you, in which case Gatsby is the obvious choice, but given its declining satisfaction and usage, you might want to try 11t instead. The last thing I want to mention when I'm talking about frameworks is a potential future for React. As we saw, React is enormous, way bigger than its nearest competitor, and also bigger than anything else out there. The only framework that I'm aware of that was ever bigger than React is now was jQuery, and that is an important historical parallel. Because jQuery never died. People say that they don't use jQuery anymore, but that's because something happened. Browser makers took the APIs that jQuery invented and built them straight into the browser. You don't need to install jQuery anymore. It is built into the fabric of the web. 100% of people use jQuery. It didn't die, it transcended. Could something like that happen to React? I can't say for certain, but what happens if React goes from 67% share to 75% or 80% or 90%? At some point, the browser makers probably need to stop and think about how to bring these idioms to the native web platform. Native web components are portable and extremely performant, but React's developer experience is extremely popular. I would really like to see somebody combine these two. So that was a ton of data. So I told you I'd give you a sense of the state of modern web development. How did I do? Let's quickly recap. We learned that B2B and B2C are equally big, but other categories that we spend less effort on, like internal tools and lead capture, are almost equally big targets of our work. Speaking of targets, we learned that we don't target mobile as much as we say that we should. And also that we build totally static sites and completely dynamic sites roughly equally often. We learned that move fast and break things is apparently the industry standard priority. And finally, in how we build, we learned that Strapi and Sanity are making waves, and that 11t is a static site generator to look out for. We learned that React is becoming bedrock to the web, and that Next.js is a front runner in frameworks. Vite is an outstanding newcomer. And we talked about the future. Will we switch to native web components? Will WASM play a role? We don't know. But if you take nothing else away, what I hope you get from this is how exciting the web is right now. There are new tools and technologies and techniques, and they are constantly pushing the boundaries of what the web can do. And we are the lucky ones who get to play with them and build it. I hope you find that thought as invigorating as I do, and thank you all for your time and attention.